Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Part 2. First of all, one should note one fact that plays a central role in the assessment of Cleopatra. A fair or even objective judgment is hardly possible. There are 3 reasons for this precarious situation for historians. 1. The few written testimonies about the Queen all come from Greek or Latin-speaking countries. There are no personal testimonies. 2. From the Egyptian side, only depictions of official buildings have survived, which do not reveal any individuality. 3. Finally, the extensive reception influences our perception. By the way, the famous film scene in which Liz Taylor allowed herself to be smuggled to Caesar in a carpet is not that wrong. According to Plutarch, it was a sigma tau, rho omega mu alpha tau omicron delta epsilon sigma mu omicron sigma, which is commonly translated as laundry bag, but is found in a dictionary from 1954 also the secondary meaning carpet roll. The Bundeskunsthalle in Bonn recently dedicated an aspect of reception under the title Cleopatra, the Eternal Diva, an exhibition. A thick description, as the ethnologist Clifford Jitz called for, as a basis for interpretation, is not possible on this basis. Rather, we must state that the colonial view of Rome determines our image, a consideration between benevolence and fascination on the one hand and rejection of Cleopatra as a symbol of Oriental decadence on the other, as Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the 14th century as the epitome of avaritia, crudelitas and luxuria, that is of greed, cruelty and self-indulgence. This ambivalence does not only apply to Cleopatra, we have already observed it in previous decades. The bad reputation of the Ptolemies, of which Cleopatra was one, is best manifested in the commentary of Octavian, who after the conquest of Alexandria only went to the tomb of Alexander the Great, but paid no respect to his successors. He explained this by saying, "I wish to see kings, not corpses." At this point, in the late summer of 30 BC, Cleopatra was already dead. Her career as co-regent began 22 years earlier, since 51 BC. As successor to her father Ptolemy XII. As Cleopatra v Philopator, she initially shared power with her brother and husband Ptolemy XIII, a circumstance that allows us to pause briefly on the question of sibling marriage. How can this unusual custom be explained? Sibling marriage had long been common among the Ptolemies. Although it was based on Egyptian principles, it is only documented in a few cases in dynastic times. There were already 2 in antiquity. Explanations for this phenomenon, while the court poet Herodotus described the marriage of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe to around 278 BC. In the sense of an interpretatio Graeca praised as an imitation of the holy marriage of Zeus and Hera, his contemporary Sotides noted critically that the king would thrust his thorn into an unholy hole. Pausanias later emphasized that this form of marriage was not corresponds to Macedonian customs, but should be connected to the Egyptian tradition. To this day, these different positions prevail in research, either representing a Hellenocentric view or pointing to models for sibling marriages in dynastic Egypt. Also of interest here is the testimony of Diodorus, who was the first to refer to the Egyptian custom of sibling marriage, and traced it back to the example of Isis. Accordingly, Costas Bursilis recently interpreted this custom as an imitation of the sacred marriage of Isis and Osiris, that is, as an interpretatio Aegyptiaca. This act was probably based on practical motives, but this incest was also spread, propagandistically using various media, for example beyond gold coins. But can sibling marriage really only be explained from the Egyptian perspective? One argument against this is that the media use tends to belong to the Greek context. If one takes the statement of Herodotus into account alongside the negative attitudes of the authors Sotides, Diodorus and Pausanias, it becomes clear that in principle neither one nor the other tradition should be violated, but rather that they should be combined with one another. Isis and Osiris were siblings, as were Zeus and Hera, so we imagine a plot that incorporated the myths of both cultures. Through the marriage of the sibling ruling couple, the religious model is historicized, the ideal. So myth becomes real history. At the same time, the deification of the ruling couple is manifested mythologically, so that myth and history are mutually dependent, and thus achieve a new form of synthesis. The sibling marriage of the Ptolemies is therefore an imitation of the Egyptian and Greek myths. But let's get back to Cleopatra. Before we examine her path onto the stage of world history, let us first take a look at the monuments that emerged in Egypt during the first years of her reign. A focus of Ptolemaic building activity was on the massive temples in Upper Egypt. The Horus Temple of Edfu was completed by her father. Immediately afterwards, on July 16, 54 BC. In the 1st century BC, construction began on the new Hathor sanctuary in Dendera. Although it was only completed under the Roman emperors, Cleopatra spent over 20 years building the temple. The major project is therefore directly linked to their rule.